Today we're going to take a look at a technique that I'm going to call lazy melodies. I heard this track the other day by the artist Luigi Tozzi, and it's called Irini, if you want to look it up. But I'm going to kind of describe what that melody does, and then kind of show you how we could do something similar in Waymaker. So, what Luigi did with this melody is that he had this melody always play the root note on the downbeat, on the first note of every bar. And then there were a couple other notes in the melody that always repeated, but he was playing with the rhythm of when those two notes occurred. So I want to create something similar in Waymaker, and we're going to do that by stacking generative sequencers. So this might be counterintuitive, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up kind of the tail of our melody. Just two notes that we want to happen sparsely or happen after that downbeat that I mentioned. So we're going to create the world's simplest house track today. We are going to just start from here. Very simple. But let's think about kind of what we want the tail of our melody to sound like. We can kind of sketch it out here. So let's say like go from a C up to a G and then to an F. Let's hear how that sounds. Okay, that sounds pretty good. But like I said before, I want these two notes to happen a bit more unpredictably. I want them to play, but I want to play around with the timing of them. So here's what we're going to do. I am going to just use this sequencer to create the tail of the melody. We're not going to worry about this note that lands on the downbeat for now. So I'm just going to turn it off. We're just going to have this tail. And then I'm going to stick a beat sequencer in front of this. Now, you've probably seen me do this technique before, but we can use the beat sequencer just to output notes on a rhythm. So I'm going to output 16th notes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a probability module after this. I'm not going to touch it yet, but we're going to take this sequence and we're going to progress it by MIDI notes. So we've got 16th notes coming out of this beat sequencer, going into this probability, and that is going to be progressing this sequence. So there really isn't a difference so far. But it gets more interesting once we put a bit of probability in the mix. Check this out. But it's a little chaotic, right? So I'm going to increase the number of steps here. I'm going to add just some rests afterwards, and it'll become clear why in a second. Because I'm going to add a sequence reset. I'm going to reset this sequence the entire sequence. I'm going to reset that every bar. So what's going to happen is we play our 16th notes with low probability, and they progress and play through this sequence. And then we kind of have this buffer at the end just to ensure that we probably won't play this again or twice per one bar. So now it's going to repeat somewhat regularly every bar. Let's see how that sounds. Awesome. But we're still missing that first note on the downbeat. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put another generative step sequencer after the previous step sequencer. And I am going to go into the settings here. I'm going to change it to generate. And by default, generative sequencers allow notes through them. So I'm going to create a complementary sequence to the one that we just created. I'm going to play just one note on the first beat, and then these notes that are happening semi-regularly are going to pass through. So now we've got our downbeat here. But what's even more interesting is we can stick things between these sequencers too. I'm going to put before this downbeat sequencer and after this tail sequencer, I'm going to stick a wait module, which is just going to modify the MIDI that's coming into it, which is just the tail, because it's in front of our downbeat. And it's going to maybe just add a chance that those notes go up a fifth. So let's hear that. Oops, I made one mistake here. I want to progress this by MIDI notes. Let's try that again. So now we occasionally get these notes coming through, just transposed around up a fifth. But we still have this downbeat, which is happening all the time. So I think this is a really interesting concept. We can kind of stack these generative sequencers in a way that they complement each other. And the notes that they're playing critically are kind of at different points in the bar. So they kind of end up summing together into one melody. I think this is pretty cool. You could even play around with, like, rather than having just a really simple beat sequence, we could make this more of a Euclidean sequence and kind of play around with, you know, kind of guaranteeing when these notes might land. You want to kind of enforce that they land on or subscribe to some kind of rhythm. I kind of like it just being completely random like this. But I think this is a really nice concept that I feel like might not be super intuitive, especially because I think this downbeat note is kind of last in our sequence, even though it's kind of the first thing you hear. But I think once you wrap your head around it, this is a pretty powerful technique. And you can kind of combine the outputs of multiple generative sequencers to accomplish a lot of different things. But in this case, we've got this cool, lazy melody. Lastly, I do want to point out that there is kind of a technically easier way to accomplish this effect, though I'll admit I was excited about finding a use case for stacking multiple generative sequencers, but we could actually accomplish it with just one sequencer, thanks to the latest version of Waymaker, which is version 1.0.4. So we can actually accomplish much the same effect if we create a probability sequence. So let me just go through. I'm going to remove this last sequencer. I'm actually going to remove the transpose as well for now. So we just have one generative sequencer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn our first stage back on. And now let's just play the melody. So the problem that we're already seeing is that our first note does not always land on the downbeat, which is what we were trying to do all along. But there's a way that we can enforce this now, thanks to a probability sequence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, let's say, just an 8-step probability sequence. I'm going to make the first step 100%, and then I'm going to drop the probability of all of the next few steps after that. And then we are going to progress this melody, let's say every 16th note. Actually, let's make it every 8th note. So what's going to happen is that when this stage is active, for the first 8th note of every bar, we're going to let through 2 16th notes here. And what that's going to do is it means we're going to play our downbeat, this rest, and then these 2 notes will happen unpredictably. So let's hear how that sounds and watch as we progress through this probability sequence. Cool. So now we've got our first note happening on every downbeat. We make sure that there's a rest, at least one rest between that and the next note. And then these 2 are kind of free to happen whenever they want. But there is one critical difference between this way of doing things and the way that I had first showed. And that is that if we want to add a transpose module, like let's say we add back our random 5th, that can apply to this first note now. If you remember, before we had a generate module, then a transpose module, and then finally another generate module. And what that meant was that the final generative module in the chain was kind of insulated from this transposing. But now that everything is in one sequence, it's possible for this transpose effect to modify the first note in our sequence. You might like this effect, or you might not, but it's just one critical difference. If you want to insulate some parts of your melody from being modified, then it can make sense to stack multiple generative sequencers. But without that, you just want to keep it simple with one generate sequencer running into one transpose sequencer, then the entire sequence is liable to be modified. like I said, it's just different. It can be a cool effect as well. In my opinion, this has a little bit less coherency and is a little bit less in the spirit of what we were originally attempting to make, but it's cool in its own right. So there are two ways that you can kind of create this effect, this sequence that progresses lazily, but it always plays on that downbeat.